On this episode of Locked On Lightning, the time is here. We're busting out our picks for who we would bring and how we would approach the offseason as GM of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Stick around, all that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Denker. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go, the fast-paced game that lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. So download Monopoly Go, now free on Google Play or the App Store. On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we are talking about our picks. We take on the hat of GM in this episode. Who's in, who's out, for how much, and how many years. So stay tuned and strap in. We're going to be talking about it throughout the entirety of the episode. And you could also go ahead and follow us on our social media pages at @LL_Lightning on Twitter, as well as Locked_On_Lightning on Instagram. If you want to give me a follow and a comment or, your reply to what I have to say on today's episode, go ahead and do so at DankyDank, DenkyD8NK. If you want to follow along, I tweeted it out about a couple hours ago. I'm recording this around 9:42 p.m. And so I'm just going to read my tweets out word for word for the most part. So the reason why we're doing this episode is because there's been a lot of GMs. If you're watching us on YouTube, I'm throwing up some quotations there. GMs, because obviously, it's the most interesting time of the year where you get to kind of make the moves before they even be made. And I think that for the first time since we've been doing this podcast, Locked On Lightning started in February of 2020. Obviously, you know what happens over the next 2 seasons, really the next 3 seasons. And then after that, we have started to see this team slowly regress from a yearly Stanley Cup contender to now a team that can't even get out of the first round. And it is our job on this episode of Locked On Lightning to figure out a way to get this team back to prominence. And of course, answer the question that is really plaguing a lot of Lightning fans as well as NHL fans. Where will Steven Stamkos sign and for how much? And, well, I'm going to answer your question right here and then, because as GM, self-appointed GM of the Tampa Bay Lightning here, by the powers bestowed upon me by Locked On Lightning and the Locked On Podcast Network, as GM of the Tampa Bay Lightning, my first course of action is to re-sign the greatest player in franchise history, the captain, the face of the franchise, Steven Stamkos, to a 5-year deal worth $5.5 million AAV. And some of you are probably saying to yourself, why would he sign that deal? It's because I sit down with him. I tell him, listen up. You are the face of the franchise, even though you can literally spell the Lightning without Steven Stamkos. You can't spell the Tampa Bay Lightning without spelling Steven Stamkos. And I explained to him, as well as I think Julian Brees-Bosch will, that really what it comes down to is that you basically give him a soft ultimatum. You say, listen, we both know you want to stay in Tampa Bay, okay? You don't want to go anywhere else. Let's be honest. That would be ludicrous for both sides for you to leave Tampa Bay, go somewhere off, play maybe a year or two there, and either come back here or go somewhere else and kind of be just a vagabond for the rest of your NHL career. Now, we tell Stammer, listen, you signed for 5.5 over the next 5 years, and we chalk it full of incentives, and we say, listen, do you want to win? Do you want to win? I know you've basically accomplished everything that a professional hockey player in North America could accomplish. Yes, but do you want to win more? Do you want to build upon those accolades? Do you want to kind of stat pad a little bit with that? And the way you could stat pad is adding better players around you. And so Stamkos, in this hypothetical world that we have created here on Locked On Lightning, agrees to a $5.5 million AAV contract for 5 years. Now, with that deal, we go on and we look at our roster and we say, listen, we need to bolster our blue line pairings. You know, Hedman had a tough year. Radish looked very promising. Nick Pervix is basically useless at this point. Obviously, you can't get rid of him just yet. But you go out, as I've said, and we've talked about Brett Pesce on this podcast. We talked about him yesterday. We talked about how really kind of root for things that end sour there in that second round playoff series with Carolina and with the Rangers. Doesn't look like it's happening, as last time I checked, the Rangers are losing that game. And it looks like we will have a 1-1 tie in that series. But what I am saying is, actually, it is tied 3-3. Okay, so it's tied 3-3, excuse me, going into the last 40 seconds of the third period with the Rangers on the power play. And as much as I would on paper, you know, if the salary cap wasn't a thing, if it wasn't something that really was, or let me correct myself, if it was something that really the Lightning were able to easily navigate around, then okay, let's go for Brett Pesce. But I think that really the smart decision here is a lot of Lightning fans that I've seen on Twitter, as well as just on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, what are you doing? Come on. It gives you the power to have a direct line almost to me and the show. We are more active on our YouTube channel. Yes, we are active on our social media channels, but YouTube is our bread and butter here on Locked On Lightning. So I think it would be wise as to not only prepare for the immediate future for winning, for getting back into the championship pedigree conversation, but to also look towards the future. Yes, Brett Pesce, he's a very good defenseman. He's really one of the better defensemen in the league that I don't think a lot of people talk about quite often. But he is also 29, and he's also going to cost a lot more money. So why don't we kind of take a step back, look towards the future, and look towards Nashville and sign defenseman Alexander Carrier to a $3 million deal AAV for 2 years. And that is because Carrier is 27. I believe we would still have team control of him after that. I'm not entirely sure over that. Don't quote me on that. But it does allow Carrier to kind of come into a new environment. Now, yes, Nashville and Tampa, in my opinion, maybe I sound a little biased, 2 different environments. One, ton of veterans who know how to win, who have been there. Nashville sniffed it about, I think that was like 8 years ago. It seems like forever ago. I want to say, yeah, it was, I think it was 17. No, it might have been 16. Yeah, I think it was 16. But yeah, still, very long time ago. Carrier, of course, was not in the league then. But what it does, allows both sides to really get to know each other in that inaugural year. Really allow the Lightning to figure out where Carrier fits in the equation of the Tampa Bay Lightning and allows Carrier to acclimate to the Tampa Bay Lightning roster. And after that, we go on, we look at our roster. We say, hey, we need some scoring, okay? The Lightning struggled with their bottom six. Their bottom six was really a lot less to be desired there, especially in the series against Florida. So we go out. Not only do we get someone who could score, but we go out and get someone who has veteran experience, someone who has been there before, who's been a little bit around the league during his time in the NHL. So we go out and we get Sean Moynihan. Now, some of you may be saying, well, listen, he's had his injury issues. Of course, he is. He has had his injury issues. But when the guy is on the ice, he is one of the better forwards in the league, veteran forwards in the league. And you look at this past year with his time, this past season that was split between Montreal and Winnipeg, okay? He, in 83 games this year, scored 26 goals and 59 points. And you stick a guy like that on your second line, maybe even your third if you want to kind of add more depth, if you want to spread the wealth around this Tampa Bay Lightning roster, I think that's a perfect scenario for you. And it's a perfect scenario for Sean Moynihan because really, other than Calgary, he, for the first time in his career, really has a legitimate chance to win. And of course, it's a both mutual beneficial deal. Moynihan plays well. Guess what? He's going to win cups or going to get a lot deeper than he ever did in Calgary. And Tampa, obviously, they get Sean Moynihan that we all know and love, a guy who could average about 25 to 30 goals a year, about 45 to 60 points a year, a guy who could play on either wing or even down the middle. You add that versatility to your lineup on the second or on the third. And also on top of that, I think you're getting him for less than what you would have to have signed Duclair for. So I think you also get that as well, that benefit. And he's a big guy, too. He can play physical if need be. He's 6'2". He's 196 pounds. You get a little bit of a beefier guy who could also, like I said, put points on the board. You throw him on that second line or third, whether it matters. You throw him on that second line with Cirelli and Stamkos. I think that's a very good line. Your top six at that point with Moynihan in the lineup is as almost better on paper than it probably was when Duclair was there this past season, past half of the season, really. And of course, the last signing that I would make would be just re-signing Mitchell Chaffee to a minimum $775K for 2 years, AAV 70. So a good deal. A guy who showed us that he is growing. Definitely came a long way from game one this year in which he played. Really showed a lot of maturity in the playoffs in his brief time. A guy that I'm really excited about to see play on the bottom six of this Lightning team. A guy that can very well play regular minutes on the third line at some point. I don't know if it's going to be this year or maybe the year after. We'll have to see. But with all those signings and Perbix being in Syracuse, that leaves Tampa with a little bit over $1 million in salary cap that they could play with and possibly look towards maybe finagling with later on in the season. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to talk about Erik Cernak. I mean, that was really kind of the thing that stonewalled a lot of the things I wanted to do with this Tampa Bay Lightning team. We talk about, could he be moved this year? Possibly. We'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about our first sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends over at Monopoly Go. Now, listen up, people. Listen up. I know I've already talked about Monopoly Go a ton of times here on Locked On Lightning, But there is just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much more to get. Unique stickers you could trade with your friends to complete albums for big prizes. Cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with. Hilarious emojis for taunting friends you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multiplayers for everything you win and or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. We are available to be downloaded wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Go ahead, subscribe to our channel. You definitely don't want to miss out on that, because you definitely don't want to miss out on the chance to comment below this video, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversation to be had among our loyal listeners here on Locked On Lightning, especially the everydayers. So if that's you, thank you for continuing to support this podcast with you just interacting and listening to us on a daily basis. And I hope you continue to do so throughout the course of the summer. And if you're new, welcome. And I can't wait to hear all you have to say about some of the moves I have made in my very short interim as fantasy lightning GM, I guess, whatever you want to call me. I don't want to call myself a armchair GM. That sounds so cliche. But we're looking at really something that kind of stopped me in my tracks. I felt like I was on a roll there with Monahan, with Carrier, Chafee, with the Stamkos deal. But I really feel like in the scenario I've created here on the podcast today, but also this kind of delves into the real world, Erik Cernak kind of presents a kind of a tough issue to solve here with the Tampa Bay Lightning. I mean, what do the Lightning really do in reality with Erik Cernak? If you've been a listener of the podcast over the course of the season, especially over the last month or so, you know I'm not really... I haven't really been too happy with Erik Cernak this year. And because it all goes back to when Ryan McDonough was traded to Nashville, we all kind of felt at the time that Erik Cernak was going to be that guy to step into his shoes and be the big-time defensive stopper. And everything that we saw prior to that really kind of showed us that that was going to be the case. And to be frank, it really hasn't since then. And I know it can't always, it can't fall on him. It's not just him. Hedman has really been defensively bad. Mikhail Sergachev, when he's healthy, has been, I wouldn't say he's been fantastic, but I wouldn't say he's been god-awful. I'm still holding out, obviously, hope for Sergachev. I just feel like he's still so raw in his development, where Cernak at times looks like he's 40 years old just by the way he moves. And it's just a weird thing to say, considering he's not even 30 yet, or not even remotely close to it. And that's the thing that kind of works in the Lightning's favor, I think. When I was going over, the potential trades that I could possibly do, there really wasn't one that stuck out to me where a team would really give up anything of value in return. Now, if you're trading Cernak, obviously you're looking to dump salary. That's really all you're doing at that point in time. You're not looking to really get anything of value in terms of a player back. I think if you're looking to trade him, it would have to be for draft picks. I don't even know if a second would even be something that could be even remotely in play if you're trading Cernak. And this is all over over the summer. Now, as for the during in season, that could very well change. But then again, if the Lightning are trading a defenseman, they're possibly trading Hedman, which I don't think at this point in time is going to happen. I don't think it's really going to happen. I mean, we've been talking about it over the last couple of days, and yes, that's a great scenario to play out in our minds, but the logic of that and the realism of that aren't really there. And that's definitely not a trade that Julian Brees-Boss would do. As for Erik Cernak, it's one of those things where the Lightning would almost have to take an L. As for how much he's worth in terms of draft picks, it really depends on the team. And we won't really know what other teams really need until after the draft. Most likely, if he is traded, it's going to be to a team that is either already a playoff team or is a team that is right on the cusp and defense is a huge problem for them. And I mean, there's really only about 5 teams that I think are really defensively solid across the NHL. Everybody else is really in dire need of defensive pieces. And that's why I said before, I think Pesci's going to get a lot more than what he's relatively worth, which is why Carrier would be a perfect match for Tampa, not only financially, but also just fit-wise. But, it's also not the worst thing in the world to kind of trade Cernak away for maybe, I would say maybe a 5 and a 6, or maybe a 4 and a 5 if you're lucky. Like I said, I mean, I don't think what he showed last year, if the Lightning get a 5 out of that, that's a pretty, I would count that as an A+, to be honest. But then on the other side of that, you're gambling with Maxwell Crozer. Basically what you're saying is Crozer is ready. You put Radish on the first line with Hedman. You put Carrier on the second with Sergachev. And then you say, and then you basically rely on 2 very young defensemen to kind of anchor your back end on that third line, which is just as important as the first line. So having 2 very young defensemen, Crozer and Lilleberg, that's a huge gamble. That's a very huge gamble. Now, you could very well possibly work out a deal where you bring back Hayden Fleury, or you could also just keep Perbix in the mix and kind of just really have a rotation of Crozer and Perbix and see what works best. Right now, I'd rather go, if I had to choose between Crozer and Perbix, I'm going Crozer just because Perbix has really, I think, lost all credibility at this point. He can't score. His defense, he maybe has one play a game to where he redeems himself, if even that. And I think that the Lightning really jumped the gun on giving him an extension a couple of years ago, and I think that really the only reason Perbix has really lasted this long is because John Cooper is a huge fan of his. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, like I said, Cernak, he's an enigma at this point. I'm not entirely sure what is the future for him. But really, it's one of those things where I think that the longer you sit there and try to figure out what's going on with him, the more you kind of compound your issues with kind of trying to build back that back end, because quite frankly, I don't think Erik Cernak's the answer going forward for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to quickly discuss why what I discussed today with my potential lineup why is this the best course for the Tampa Bay Lightning? We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But first, we're going to wrap things up with our last sponsors of today's show, and that is our friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook. Now, it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win on your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So one last time, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are shipping in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Please go ahead, comment below. Let me know how I did. I want to see grades. I want to see critiques. And yeah, we'll continue to talk about it. If you want to tweet to me, go ahead at DankyDank, DENKYD8NK. Love hearing from all of you. So real quick, before I wrap things up on the show, real quick, why is what the moves I laid out for the Tampa Bay Lightning the best course of action? Because unless something catastrophic happens, which if that does, and what I mean is player goes to LTIR, then you have extra money on hand. But I mean, what are you really in theory holding on to that money for? If you're serious about getting right back into the mix, if you're the Tampa Bay Lightning, of being a Stanley Cup contender, the moves that I made out for you are not only allowing you to get back into that mix, because that team on paper that I discussed, except for maybe that third line, which is probably going to have to be something that's going to have to be figured out over the course of the year, whether John Cooper believes that eventually Erik Cernak is a third line defenseman, and maybe you move whomever up. I don't know. It's one of those things where it's a complicated situation. So real quick to summarize, my potential lines to begin the season would be Hagel, Point, Cooch, Stamkos, Cirelli, Moynihan, Jeannot, Paul, Eyssimont, Sheary, Glendening, and Chafee. On the back end, you got Hedman, Radish, Sergachev, Carrier, and Lilleberg, Cernak. The only thing that I would maybe switch around, if so, would be Moynihan and Jeannot, kind of just matchup kind of stuff. And even, obviously we all know that Hagel, Stamkos is going to get switched here and there throughout the course of the season. But this is a team that, like I just kind of laid out, is a team that you could definitely switch around and have multiple versions of lines if need be. I didn't feel as much as, even though Cooper changed around the lines a lot last year, I felt almost as if they weren't as versatile as even though he tried to make it out to be. With this team, I think that, I spoke about it with a listener, I think last week, about how really, I wouldn't be mad if we have a situation where Cirelli's on the first line. That would honestly be a pretty good line. And then you add Moynihan to the mix, so you don't have to have Stamkos playing center. That second line, if you move Cirelli up to the first, could very well be Stamkos, Cirelli, or excuse me, Hagel, Moynihan, and Stamkos. Or even if you want to change that more, if you feel like Moynihan is going to be kind of more of a grinder this year, you throw him on that third line. I think Nick Paul is ready for some second line ice time, full time. And if you want to have a Jeannot, Moynihan, Eyssimont line, that also works too. Like I said, that fourth line might be a little hairy. Really, the question mark there is going to be Sheary. What version of him are we going to get this year? Are we going to get the guy who just completely was a non-factor all season long? Or are we going to get the guy who in the last couple of weeks of the season had glimpses of his former self from his time in Washington and Pittsburgh? Like I said, that third line, I think Lilleberg, Cernak on the third line pairing. Lilleberg, Cernak, I think that's a good combo because you got the veteran guy who, even though he's not playing up to where we would like him to be, you pair him with a young gun. Maybe that injects some life in him. Maybe he rolls into that teacher role very well. And then on the other side of that, you got Sergachev and Carrier. So the whole reasoning for this, other than monetary reasonings, is that you're rolling around a Tampa Bay Lightning team that is very versatile, that could play a lot of roles. You have a lot of players that could wear a lot of hats. And I think that if the two Stanley Cup teams are any testament, is that you need to have players like that. And I think that's what you get with my version of the Tampa Bay Lightning. So let me know in the comments below how you feel. Where was the moments I went right? Where were the moments I went wrong with this team? Why do you see maybe other players being on this team other than maybe the ones that I said? Let me know in the comments below. So we'll be back tomorrow to talk more about Lightning news and predictions, as well as what we'll see this offseason. But in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Denker. I'll talk to you in the next one.